Hello, I'm Ioannis Paschalidis. I'm at Boston University and I'm a faculty in engineering and in computing and data sciences. And I'm also director of the Hariri Institute for Computing and Computational Science and Engineering. This is a presentation recorded for the 2022 CTSI Symposium, and I will talk about predicting COVID-19 outcomes from electronic health records, and specifically we'll examine some biases that some of these models exhibit and also the role of the social determinants of health. Before I start, very briefly an introduction into the Hariri Institute at BU, which is a federation of a number of different centers and initiatives ranging from the more traditional academic centers, such as, for instance, the Center for Information and Systems Engineering, the Center for Computational Science, the AI Research Initiative, and then less traditional centers and initiatives, including the Boston Women's Workforce Council, which is a public university-private partnership, the Red Hat Collaboratory and the Mass Open Cloud Alliance, and our Software Application and Innovation Lab, which is a software development shop within a university setting. In my group, we work on developing predictive models for disease and important events, such as, for instance, hospitalizations, and also other models that prescribe treatment when, for instance, there are multiple options for a treatment that needs to be followed for a certain condition. During the pandemic, we spent quite a bit of time working on COVID, and specifically we developed models that predicted the level of care requirements for patients that tested positive for COVID-19. And you will see in this slide the number of different studies we did during the pandemic. We worked with a number of different data sets, including data sets from Massachusetts. So, for instance, this work was based on a data set from Mass General Brigham. We worked with a data set from the Boston Medical Center that I will say a little bit more about later in this talk. And also, we worked with national data sets, one data set coming from China, from the area of Wuhan, the early epicenter of the epidemic, and then other national data sets, one from Brazil, one from Mexico. So in this talk, what I will do is I will describe in more detail the work that was related to the data set we examined from the Boston Medical Center, which is affiliated with Boston University. We had the entire 2020 COVID cohort at BMC, which consisted of 7,100 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19. Just some very basic statistics, about 19.5% of those were admitted. Of those admitted, 23.6% ended up in the ICU. Of those that were admitted to the ICU, 58.7% were intubated, and of those intubated, about 70% actually did not make it, did not survive the disease. We had demographics, vitals, radiology reports, medical history, symptoms, a whole host of different labs before and during the hospitalization for those that were hospitalized, medications, depression information, zip code, and also had information about the hospital occupancy during the times that so these patients were admitted to the hospital for those that ended up being hospitalized. We also had access to information about the social determinants of health that were obtained from the so-called Thrive survey. This is a unique survey done at BMC, where every patient that has an encounter with BMC is asked to fill a questionnaire and provide information about their social needs around 8 different domains that you see in the slide. Because we had access to radiology reports, we had to deploy fairly sophisticated natural language processing methods in order to extract the specific radiology findings that were of interest for the study from the text, from the radiology report. And we developed robust interpretable models to predict hospitalization, ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, and death. I will not cover every model that we developed, but I will give you some examples. In order to develop the model, we considered the time of the event of interest, for example, an ICU admission. And then looking back in time, we formed certain time windows and information vitals, for instance, procedures, medications, whatever was done with the patient during a specific window was summarized and was used as a feature in order to predict the event of interest. We did not use information that was too close to the event of interest. For instance, if you want to predict an ICU admission 1 minute before that admission is recorded, you have ample information and perhaps it is very clear that the patient is heading to the ICU. So that would have been a relatively easy task. Whereas we will see admissions that had used information much earlier and predictions of that type are harder to make. In order to capture the dynamic evolution of the vitals, particularly, we developed a deep learning model using this technology, long short-term memory cells in the neural network and a transformer architecture, which is very appropriate for processing time series. And the network was trained in order to produce a vital score. Just using the vital score, one could predict the outcome. But as you will see, we combine that vital score in an ensemble model along with other variables in order to make better predictions. So the hospitalization model was fairly accurate. The best model had an accuracy area under the curve of 92%. Linear models such as logistic regression were a bit less accurate than the nonlinear boosted tree model. And however, the linear models provided information on the variables that were strongly associated with a hospitalization. And you will see in this table those variables, and you will see next to each one of these variables a coefficient where that determines the significance of that variable. The higher the value, the absolute value of the coefficient, the more likely it is for that feature to increase the likelihood of a hospitalization. A positive sign means that the likelihood of hospitalization increases. A negative side, it means that the likelihood of hospitalization decreases. You will see some important pre-existing conditions. Most of them were contributing to a hospitalization where COPD did not, and that is interesting by itself. You'll also see that the occupancy of the hospital, so the non-COVID and also the COVID occupancy of the hospital, decreased the likelihood that the patient will be admitted. And you will also see that two important social determinants of health, need for food and need for transportation, increase the likelihood of hospitalization. And this is consistent with other work we have done. For instance, in the Brazilian data set, we also saw that geographic location, a public versus private hospital, and illiteracy of the patient were contributing factors towards the hospitalization. What we found interesting was that the model that we trained was actually exhibiting some racial bias. So for instance, for Black patients, the model was much more eager to predict that the patient was going to be hospitalized. And this led to a twice as large probability of a false positive prediction for Black patients compared to white patients. And correspondingly, for white patients, the model was less likely to predict that the patient was going to be hospitalized. And that also led into inequity in terms of the false negative rate. So the false negative rate for whites was significantly larger than the false negative rate for Black patients. So we had to take corrective action and correct these models, and it is possible to do that, and I will not go into details, so that you can make the model more equitable and equalize false positive rates and false negative rates for the two cohorts. For ICU predictions, clearly when we try to predict an ICU admission close to the event, we can achieve greater accuracy, where if you are trying to predict early, such an ICU admission, for instance, 24 hours in advance, the accuracy or the AUC of the model drops. Nevertheless, it remains a fairly strong model that can predict with relatively high accuracy an admission to the ICU, which could be useful for many different reasons. And you can see that in fact, the vital score that I talked about earlier was the most important variable. In fact, it conveys most of the information, and that on its own gives you a pretty good predictive power. You will also see that the COVID occupancy of the hospital, so for instance, if the hospital had too many COVID patients, was less likely to lead to an ICU admission. For instance, measures maybe have taken so that the patient could be taken care of on the floor rather than an ICU that was extremely busy. And we also saw that some key important biomarkers, or LDH in particular, lactate dehydrogenase, and the C-reactive protein were strong predictors of an ICU admission, and this is consistent with other work that we did in other cohorts. We, in fact, developed calculators that we made available to our website for physicians to use these models in order to predict what will happen to the patients that they were taking care of. And in a number of interesting cases, the models actually did surprise the physicians. We found cases where the model would predict quite early, perhaps upon admission, and to the hospital, an ICU admission where the patient appeared to be stable, normal, and a physician would not have predicted that this patient is heading to the ICU. So this is a summary of the work I wanted to present. I would like to thank my group, many students that have contributed to this work, and they are listed here, including former members of the lab that have now graduated, also our collaborators at the Boston Medical Center that collaborated with us on the specific work I presented, our collaborators at MGH that were involved in our work with the MGH cohort, and then collaborators in Mexico, Brazil, and China with the work that we did with those cohorts. Thank you very much for your attention.